Hey everyone, Nick from Accounting Add-ons here. And in this video, I'll show you two different ways you can create a year-to-date measure using DAX. For sample data, we'll use invoices downloaded from Xero into Power BI using OdataLink. But as always, this approach can be used for any type of data, including MYOB, and can also be used in Excel. Now let's get into it. So the first thing we'll do will be to get our data using OdataLink. So I'll jump to the OdataLink website and I'll go to the OData Feeds page and I'll copy our Xero demo URL. I'll then go get data from OData Feed and paste that in and click OK. And we'll be interested in two different endpoints. The first endpoint will be the dates table and the second endpoint will be the invoices table. I'll click transform. And what we'll do now is actually clean up the data and only keep what we're interested in. In the dates table, we'll keep all the fields except the calendar month, calendar year, and financial month. And we'll expand the display string to only include the month and year. I'll click OK. And the dates table is ready. For the invoices table, we'll remove all the fields we're not interested in. We'll filter the type only to look at account receivables or sales. And we'll keep removing the other fields. So I'll remove these ones. I'll keep the total field, but I'll remove all these ones. For the status field, we'll only keep authorized, paid, and submitted, and we'll actually remove the other ones from being downloaded, which will speed up the process a bit. I'll move the filters together and the remove columns together. Now once I've done that, I can click close and apply, and I'll wait for the data to download. The next step will be to add a relationship between invoices and dates. So I'll right click on our endpoints and we'll choose manage relationships. We'll click the new button and we'll add a relationship between the invoices date field and the dates table date field. Make sure it's many to one because many invoices can link to a single date. And we can click OK. And we can click close. As a starting point for the chart, we'll add a bar chart, which will make it fit the whole page. And in it, we'll include the display string on the axis. We'll include the total amount for the values. We'll also pull the date and we'll put it as a tooltip. The reason we do that is so that we can actually sort by that date to actually get all our bars in the right order. Sort ascending. And if I scroll a bit, you can actually see the bar charts are there. Now we're only going to be interested in 2 years of data because there's way too much information. So on the filters, we'll drag a financial year filter on this page. We'll set it to basic and we'll only include 2021 and 2022. And that's basically the starting point for our chart already. Now there's two different approaches when it comes to actually setting up a year-to-date measure. The first approach will be using the totals year-to-date function. So I'll right click on my invoice table and I'll choose new measure. And I'll call my measure total year-to-date 1. Now this approach requires a totals year-to-date function. And that function allows you to sum a specific value. So we'll sum the invoices total field. The next parameter allows us to specify our dates table. In this case, it's the dates date field. And the next parameter is a filter. Now we're interested in all our dates, so we'll choose all dates. Finally, the third parameter is choosing the end date for every single year. Now that's entered as month/day. And Power BI being made in America, you'll need to enter the month first and the day second. So it'll be 06/30 because we want our financial year to end 30th of June. If we click OK, we've got our measure defined. We can then drag it onto our chart and you can see the total year to date is actually working. You can see it's growing and then it flatlines and it'll reset for the next year, and it'll grow and then flatline. So that's the first approach. Now you might be wondering why we have to use a dates table. And to illustrate that, I'll do two modifications. I'll edit my query, and I'll actually remove invoices in January 2022. Now notice when I make this change, the light blue band in January 22 is no longer there, but the year to date is still valid. It still is flatlining. But if I remove and change from the dates table to just use the invoices date field, what's going to happen is two things. Number one, for every future data that I don't have data points, notice that the year-to-date line has disappeared. And that's because a data point doesn't actually exist in order to calculate it. I'm only looking at dates in the invoices table, and there is no dates in March 21, April, May, so on and so forth, and no dates in January 2022. And that's one of the drawbacks of not using a dates table. If we use a dates table, on the other hand, we ensure that irrespective of everything, the data will be able to calculate. The data point will be able to calculate because it will have a date that it can run it for. Now, one of the advantages of the total year-to-date function is that it's nice and concise. On top of that, you can actually see it does a year-to-date function. You can tell what field it's summing, in this case invoices total, and you can also tell how the financial year ends. But one of the downside is that it actually doesn't have that much flexibility if you're trying to build a model that you distribute to many organizations. Because you're hard coding the end year concept, if you're trying to build it for Australia, 30th of June makes sense because our financial year does go July to June. But if you want to build it for New Zealand, you'll have to change this parameter so that it goes April to March. And unfortunately, that means that every time you want to distribute your model, you'll potentially have to modify it in order to suit the environment that it's being used in. That brings us to our second approach of using a rolling total to do the same calculation. So we'll right-click on the invoices table and choose new measure, and we'll name our measure total YTD number 2. This will use a calculate function, and it'll do a sum of the invoices total field, same way as the year-to-date function. We'll then apply a filter, and this filter will need to look at all the dates table. Now the second parameter of the filter table of the filter function will be to actually filter and set up our rolling total. The first thing we'll do is we're interested in the dates that are less or equal to the max dates date. And I'll explain that a bit later. And the second comparison we'll want to do is the dates financial year must be equal to the max of the dates financial year. Once we've done that, we'll close a few of those parentheses and we should be good. We can then drag the total year-to-date column into our report, and you'll notice it produces the exact same figures. Now let's break this formula down a bit clearer. If we expand it again, we can actually see it calculates, so it converts a value into a measure, and it'll do a sum of all the total values. But then it'll filter the data based on the dates table, looking at all the dates, and it'll do a comparison between the date linked with the relationship and all our dates table, and the same thing, the financial year linked by the relationship and all the financial years. Every formula or DAX measure that you create operates within a context. And in the case of our chart, the context is the months going across the page. So for every one of these data points that goes across the page, it'll run this comparison to determine whether the invoice value or the value of an invoice needs to be included in that column. So it'll look at the date of the invoice and it'll compare it with all the other dates in our dates table to determine whether it needs to be included in the calculation. Now the reason we've got to use the dates table is we can only use fields that belong to the source data. So I can't actually use invoices date here, it'll turn up an error. I can only use the dates table because that's what we're filtering by. Now importantly, we need to make sure we use the all function on our dates table. If we remove it, we'll realize our rolling total will fail. And that's because what it's now doing is it's filtering on the dates table based on the relationship. So 1-to-1, a single invoice has a single date. But what we want to actually do is look at each invoice and include all the dates for each invoice. So that's why we do an all dates function, to make sure all the dates are included, and that's what makes the max function work further down. If we restore the formula back to what it was and click out, the year-to-date's back. Now, one thing that's interesting with this rolling total approach is you can make it do something completely different, which is a to-date measure. And to do that, we'll copy our formula and we'll right-click, new measure. I'll call this measure total to date number 2, and I'll simply remove the financial year component of that measure. So it'll do essentially the same rolling total sum, but it will not be constrained by financial year. If we do that, and we include this measure on our chart, you'll notice that the purple line is going up and then flat lines when there's no values, but then keeps going up past the point of the financial year. So that rolling total, the only reason it was resetting down to 0 at the end of every financial year was because we were constraining it here by financial year. So you can actually use this rolling total approach to do two different things, either a year-to-date measure or a to-date value. So now that we've created our measures, we can polish off our chart. So I'll remove the to-date value and I'll remove one of the year-to-date values since I'm only interested in a single value. I'll then go to the display. On the x-axis, I'll remove the title. I'll do the same thing for the y-axis. And I'll do the same thing for the title on the chart. Sorry, title's here. And there you have it. This chart, if I click off the measure, is our year-to-date chart showing the total value of sales by month and by year-to-date. One last thing we can do if we want to be perfectly precise, we can rename our values from total to month-to-date for display purposes, and total year-to-date. And that's it. So that brings us to the end of the video showcasing you how to create year-to-date measures within Power BI or Excel using DAX. I hope you found this video interesting, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.